Welcome. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate you all being here today. My name is Paul Glastras. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly and a senior fellow here at the New America Foundation. So on behalf of the Washington Monthly and New America, thanks for coming. We're here today to discuss a special report just released in the current issue of the Washington Monthly called The Agent Orange Boomerang, which you can read at washingtonmonthly.com. And before I start, I just want to thank New America, thank the staff of the Washington Monthly, and also Charles Bailey of the Ford Foundation for his support. From 1962 to 1971, the U.S. military sprayed close to 20 million gallons of the herbicide Agent Orange across Vietnam to defoliate dense jungle in order to better detect movement of personnel and equipment from north to south and to destroy enemy crops. That spraying, we now know, left behind a residue of dioxin, a persistent and highly toxic chemical. And over the next 2 decades, American soldiers who served in Vietnam were forced to fight another long war, this one to force their own government to recognize the damage dioxin had done to their bodies and to provide health care and other benefits they deserved. Washington did so in 1991 when President George H.W. Bush signed the Agent Orange Act into law. And in the years since, justice seemingly done, the issue of Agent Orange has largely disappeared from the news. But in reality, the problem of Agent Orange never really went away. In fact, it is now morphing into a new set of problems for our nation's leaders. It turns out that dioxin, a long-acting toxin, is continuing to damage lives in Vietnam, not only for those exposed to it during the war, but for their children and their grandchildren. The government of Hanoi estimates that as many as 400,000 Vietnamese have died early from ailments related to the exposure to dioxin, and that 500,000 children have birth defects because of exposure to the chemicals leaching into soil and water. Until recently, the effects of Agent Orange were not something the Vietnamese government talked much about. After normalizing relations with the United States in 1995, Hanoi's overwhelming goal was to win favorable trade deals with the United States and admission to global bodies like the World Trade Organization. Bringing up unpleasant subjects like Agent Orange worked against that strategy. But having attained these goals, the Hanoi has begun to press its demands and is demanding compensation for the suffering of its people, and that has put the United States in a tough spot. Not wanting to set a precedent, but on the other hand, recognizing that Vietnam is an increasingly vital military security ally and trading partner. It also raises a much larger issue of what responsibility the U.S. military or any military has to clean up the environmental messes it leaves behind after a war. And that's an issue we're likely to face as we pull out of Iraq and ultimately from Afghanistan. Meanwhile, another hidden problem with Agent Orange is impacting our veterans. With each passing year, medical researchers are discovering more and more illnesses, many of them major chronic diseases like Parkinson's, for which exposure to Agent Orange turns out to be a risk factor. Yet hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans suffering from these conditions have been denied VA care for years, and as they've waited for the science to prove that the suffering they've been having is indeed service-related. So the problem of Agent Orange, which we thought we had put behind us, is once again staring us in the face. And in this latest issue of the Washington Monthly, we have this special report that looks at these new developments and makes the case that we finally should do what we should have done actually years ago, and that is to offer humanitarian aid to the Vietnamese for the suffering of those affected by Agent Orange, and to do right by our veterans, and to offer VA care to all who served, no questions asked. You can agree or disagree with those arguments, but I think there's no doubt, and I think we've documented pretty carefully that this is an issue that is going to be on the radar screen for the Obama administration, for Congress, and for the VA. So to discuss these issues, we've brought together a panel of writers and experts who I'm honored to introduce now. Dr. Michael F. Martin is a specialist in Asian affairs for the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress. Dr. Martin's professional careers included work in China, Japan, Hong Kong, and Vietnam, and he has taught at Hong Kong Baptist University, Colby College, and Tufts University. Clay Risen is managing editor at Democracy, a journal of ideas. He is formerly on the staff of the New Republic and has written on history, politics, and culture for a variety of publications, including the New York Observer, the Atlantic Monthly, the Smithsonian, and now the Washington Monthly. Phil Longman, a frequent contributor to the Washington Monthly, is a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation here and the author with Ray Bishara of The Next Progressive Era, A Blueprint for Broad Prosperity. Also a fine book on the VA called Best Care Anywhere. So let me begin by asking to the podium Dr. Michael Martin.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and bringing up this issue that is proving to be very timely and perhaps of increasing concern in the days ahead. Before I begin with my short, brief presentation, the quick disclaimer: the views I'm reflecting today are my own and my personal views on the issue. They do not necessarily reflect the views of Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress. What I'd like to do for the time that I have is to focus on this issue more from the Vietnamese perspective, or at least my understanding of the Vietnamese perspective, than looking at the U.S. aspects of it. And with that in mind, what I would first like to do is talk about three particular elements of the issue, a little bit of a background on each of those issues, and then talk a bit about, from the Vietnamese perspective, how this impacts on U.S.-Vietnam relations. In terms of those three main key issues, I sort of boil it down into environmental remediation, that is to say, dealing with the environmental damage that's been caused by the dioxin. Second, the healthcare issues that are associated with people who have been exposed to dioxin in Agent Orange. And third, an area that sometimes doesn't get enough consideration, which is a continuation of scientific research about the effects of dioxin and Agent Orange on people. So let me go through these as quickly as I can, but to try to be concise. In terms of the environmental remediation issue, Hatfield Consultants, a Canadian company, has done a number of studies in Vietnam to try to determine where indeed dioxin and Agent Orange remains in the environment. And basically they came up with this concept of hot spots, places where the concentration levels are high, generally due to basically spillage and loss during the movement of Agent Orange, not areas that were sprayed. By and large, their studies have found that the residuals in sprayed areas, even heavily sprayed areas, are not at the international threshold for posing extended danger. Now, whether or not those studies are comprehensive is a whole issue, but as a result, there's a focus on these hot spots. There appears to be somewhere in the 20 to 30 hot spots around the country, but 3 of them have become the prominent focus of the efforts to date on this issue. And oddly enough, they're all 3 around what used to be U.S. military bases. Excuse my Vietnamese pronunciation. I've been there, but I'm not very good at Vietnamese. Phuket is one of them. Bien Hoa is another. And the major one of U.S. interest is at Da Nang, which was the primary military base for U.S. military operations during the war. Okay. If you look at the Vietnamese perspective, the most recent figure that I found is that they estimate it'll cost somewhere around $60 million to clean up Da Nang Airport. There is a joint effort going on between the United States and the Vietnamese government. To date, in terms of resources that have been dedicated by the United States on this effort, roughly $4 million. Just recently, they announced the contracting of $1.7 million, $1.69 to be more precise, for the construction of a secure landfill. Now, I've been to the facility, and what has been done to date is effectively a containment effort, a way of trying to limit public access to contaminated soil, water, lakes, ponds, as well as the creation of a catchment area to catch any water that would be contaminated with dioxin so that it does not spread further in the ecosystem. But this has now created a new situation, which is to say, having contained the problem, they're moving to cleanup. And there, at least the last I heard, is the question was, do you just try to clean it up right away or basically move the contaminated soil out of the area and find a way of cleaning it up later? It appears that they have chosen to do the latter. That is to say, move it to an area in a secure landfill and then find a way of trying to remove the dioxin from the environment. One of the ways of doing that is a experimental bioremediation technology, which is being utilized, which is hopefully of greater use than just this one application, but could be used in other situations around the world. There has been some criticism in the Vietnamese press and from the Vietnamese government about the speed at which this cleanup program has proceeded. However, my impressions have been that by and large, the relationship between the U.S. entities and the Vietnamese entities that are involved in this containment and cleanup activity has been generally fairly good and fairly successful. Moving it then on to the healthcare issue, then things start getting a little more problematic. And part of the big issue is the actual scope or scale of the issue is really unknown. If you look at Vietnamese figures, we've already heard the figure of 400,000 deaths attributable to exposure to Agent Orange and dioxin. The Vietnamese themselves come up with a figure of up to 4.8 million people in Vietnam that have health or medical problems associated with exposure to the dioxin in Agent Orange. And one recent media report put the 10-year estimated cost of dealing with the health effects of Agent Orange dioxin at $30 billion. To give you some perspective on the scope of this, the latest figure I could see of the Vietnamese government in terms of their annual outlay to deal with the issue is $44 million. So we're a few scales off from each other. 30 billion on the one side, 44 million on the other. U.S. assistance dealing with the healthcare aspects of Agent Orange in Vietnam, to date, 2 million, which is, again, give you an idea, we're moving orders of magnitude as we go from one to the other. Part of the problem behind it is issues identifying the victims or people associated with the exposure of Agent Orange dioxin. As you can probably imagine, at the time of war, it wasn't exactly clear who was where exactly when, particularly given the nature of the warfare that was going on in Vietnam. Since the war, a number of people have moved and relocated around Vietnam. So the actual physical location at this time may not be associated with exposure. The result is it isn't clear who exactly was exposed to Agent Orange and dioxin when they were in Vietnam. Second, even if they were exposed, it isn't 100% clear how much they themselves have been affected by it. And one of the issues associated with that is the cost of trying to do such a study. Agent Orange is not water soluble, it's fat soluble. I'm not a scientist in this regard. But what it means is you have to do a fat test, fat tissue test. And the last estimate I saw was $2,000 per test. So needless to say, given the Vietnamese government's resources and the government's available, doing comprehensive testing on everybody in Vietnam would be a prohibitively expensive cost, particularly given that the alternative would be to utilize it to take care of people who they believe are affected by Agent Orange. Another element, and this is again my personal view, is that there is a little bit of conflation in Vietnam between victims of Agent Orange, as it's often put, and people with certain medical conditions. There is almost a presumption that if you have a certain type of medical condition, it is attributable to exposure to Agent Orange. Case spinal bifida would be an example of one. The VA recognizes spinal bifida as a birth defect that could be associated with Agent Orange. In Vietnam, if a child has spinal bifida, it's often presumed that it's related to Agent Orange exposure, even though it may not be. So, moving on then, quickly, the area of scientific research. If you look back over the time period since the war, there was an effort for joint research between the United States government and the Vietnamese government to try to identify the extent of this problem. It foundered. It did not really go as well as had hoped. There was sort of a period where they pulled away from it. This seems to be reemerging as an area of willingness to do research. However, as I sort of indicated earlier, the ability to do such research is difficult. Identifying people, for example, if you want control groups, people who weren't exposed and people who were exposed. Inside Vietnam, it's very difficult to differentiate those two populations, simply because people have moved around and people weren't exactly aware that they were being sprayed with Agent Orange and dioxin. Second, as I indicated, the cost of actually doing the study, tissue sampling, to determine whether or not somebody has a high level of dioxin in their system is another problem. Third, when you get to the, even if you've determined that the individual has dioxin in their system, it doesn't necessarily mean the health conditions or problems that they have is associated with the dioxin that's in their system. There may be other contributing factors. Okay. There are a number of new initiatives that are going on in Vietnam. My understanding is that a census is being done under the auspices of the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment, as well as the Ministry of Health, to try to identify within the Vietnamese population individuals who may have been adversely affected by dioxin. In addition, there was a recent joint Japanese-Vietnamese study that looked at 47,000 veterans inside Vietnam, Vietnamese nationals, trying to differentiate them between exposed and non-exposed to see whether or not there is indeed a higher incidence of certain health problems among those exposed to Agent Orange and dioxin. That study confirmed that, yes, there is a differentiation. Okay. Let me finish then by talking a little bit about the impact on U.S. and Vietnamese relations. As you've already heard, for a period of time, the Vietnamese government seemed to accept that this issue can remain on the back burner. It wasn't that it wasn't raised, but they were willing to let it be set aside so that other priorities for the Vietnamese government could move forward, such as the return of diplomatic recognition to Vietnam, membership in the World Trade Organization, normal trade relations. Those seem to take more of a priority than trying to press this issue. However, on the other side, on the U.S. side, there were issues associated with the war that also took precedent over the Agent Orange issue, which is the MIA POW issue. Effectively, in the United States, nothing much could go on other issues until the United States government felt that that was adequately addressed. We have apparently moved into a period where they do see that's been adequately addressed. As these issues fell to the side, as normal trade relations were established, diplomatic recognition, WTO membership, all these issues set aside, it basically allowed Agent Orange and the associated concerns to perk higher up on the priority list in Vietnam, and they were willing to bring the issue forward more. That is not to say that there aren't other issues that threaten, or I shouldn't say threaten, but could push Agent Orange off of the front burner and into the back burner again. For example, Vietnam this past year applied for membership in the Generalized System of Preference, a trade preference policy of the United States government. That application is still pending. No decision has come from either the Bush administration or the Obama administration. So pushing on Agent Orange may possibly, in the eyes of the Vietnamese, have adverse effects on their GSP application, so they may be willing to step back for a little while on that. Another issue coming forward is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an initiative to form a free trade association in Asia. The United States just recently announced that they are going to enter into formal negotiations to join what we call the TPP. Vietnam has also expressed an interest in joining the TPP. And so you may have a trade-off on TPP negotiations versus Agent Orange in the future. My next point is to, in some ways, contradict myself in that I keep talking about the Vietnamese government, the Vietnamese perspective. One of the things that I came away with in my research in Vietnam is that there is no unified Vietnamese government perspective on this. Different ministries, different agencies have a different take on the issue. There's Committee 33 or Office 33 that has officially been given the authority to deal with this issue. They're trying to coordinate this issue and have done, from what I see, a fairly effective job on that. However, different ministries, different agencies may have different perspectives on the issue. Ministry of Health may be primarily concerned about the health effects and trying to adequately address the health effects. What's called MOLISA, the Ministry of Labor, sometimes war invalids or just invalids and social affairs, also deals with the Agent Orange issue. They deal with providing benefits. They're concerned about it. On the other hand, the site at the Da Nang airport is under the Ministry of Defense's authority. They would like to extend the runway. They are interested in making that available. So their priority may be in getting the contaminant out of the area. They can extend the runway and proceed on that project and let somebody else worry about the cleanup later. So you start seeing the beginning of tensions within the Vietnamese government on how to deal with it. Even other industries that you may not think of. The Ministry of Industry and Trade, for example. Some of the things that Vietnam is best known around the world for exporting, say carp, catfish, tra basa in the Vietnamese, are bottom-feeding fish. Dioxin tends to settle to the bottom of the aquatic environment, so the catfish may be a primary source of it getting into the food chain in Vietnam or around the world. So needless to say, the Ministry of Industry and Trade would like to sort of downplay problems associated with dioxin possibly being in the fish, ducks, geese, being the types of exports that may have dioxin in it. Similarly, the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment may have mixed feelings about the issue. One, they want cleanup, but on the other hand, they don't want to imply that agricultural products coming out of Vietnam are inherently contaminated. However, having now pointed out that there are some tensions within the Vietnamese government, there are certain elements that I found consistently reflected in different agencies in Vietnam on the issue. First was, time and time again, the Vietnamese talked about the contrast between how the U.S. Vietnam War veterans were being treated in U.S. policy and the U.S. government's attitude towards Vietnamese war veterans and the Vietnamese civilian population from the war. In the U.S., the policy, and I'll let others speak about that, is a sort of presumption of exposure, and therefore, given the presumption of exposure, medical conditions can be treated and provide benefits due to that exposure. We have not correspondingly treated the Vietnamese population. Second, there is some confusion from the apparent priorities in U.S. funding. For example, as I mapped out earlier, there's about $6 million that have been provided by the United States government to deal directly with the Agent Orange issue at the Da Nang airport. That contrasts a bit sharply with $323 million that's been provided to Vietnam under what's called the PEPFAR program. So whereas PEPFAR, which deals with HIV/AIDS, is $323 million through this fiscal year, Agent Orange, which perhaps in the Vietnamese eyes is a more serious issue, has received 2. Or 6, if you want to look at it in the whole part. At this time, my sense is the Vietnamese government are more concerned about not addressing blame or who's responsible or legal obligations. They really want to work on solving their problems, dealing with the issues at hand. The last point I'd also make, which is just to throw it out, on several occasions, from the Vietnamese perspective, I heard statements that saying, we cannot fully normalize relations with the United States until the Agent Orange issue has been addressed. So from their perspective, we have not normalized relationships yet. It's a process. We're partway there. I'm going a little bit long. My apologies. A couple quick things. The U.S. response to date, as I've indicated, there's been $6 million appropriated by Congress specifically to deal with this issue. $3 million in FY07 and FY09. Is there more to come? That's a good question. We shall see. The House Foreign Affairs Committee has held 2 hearings on the issue. Are there more to come? Again, time will tell. The Obama administration has been actively trying to get the disbursement of the funds that have been appropriated. They have personnel in place dedicated to this project. and they continue to work through the Joint Advisory Committee to facilitate government-to-government communications. Last, just to reiterate, earlier I mentioned GSP and TPP as issues that may impact on how much there's a willingness to work on Agent Orange issue. I'd add two more. One, recently there's been increasing concern about the human rights situation in Vietnam, particularly treatment of the media. And second, the issue of workers' rights continues to be an ongoing issue between the United States and Vietnamese government. So, do I provide you any answers? No, but hopefully I've provided you some useful information, and I will hand the podium over to the next speakers, and I'm ready and willing to answer questions later. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate Paul including me in this esteemed panel and New America hosting us. The focus of the article that I wrote for the package was really or the purpose of it was to take a step back and say, what is the historical, legal, international context within which questions about U.S. obligations or the possibilities of U.S. action to remediate Agent Orange take place? Are there bases for obligations, either legal, moral, or political, or even just possible leverages, points of leverage where the U.S. could be brought to address these questions? And the answer, unfortunately, is no, there aren't very many. But in the article, I tried to explain a little bit about how, if you were nevertheless to, as a policymaker, try to construct a way to push the U.S. toward greater responsibility or recognition of its need to act, how would you do that? So the first thing to keep in mind is when you talk about the environmental consequences of war, there are really two kind of broad categories. One is, and they're somewhat artificial, but the first one is the consequences of actual war fighting. So you explode a bomb, you shoot a gun, you lay out a landmine, these sorts of things. There are very few, and there are very few points of international law or really efforts to control this aspect of military activity, and very little interest on the part of the global community to do something. The reason for it is obvious. If you are a country that has a military and you want to make sure that your military is effective, you don't want to be creating a corpus of international law that restricts unnecessarily your ability to act. So there has been activity on certain things, sort of on the edges, like banning weather modification or restricting the deployment of landmines. Landmines are actually a horrible thing for the environment. Animals step on them, they leach chemicals, and they're often not mapped. Chemical weapons, the control of chemical weapons and the eradication of chemical weapons is a big step in that regard. But the core idea that we should try to reduce the impact of conventional warfare on the environment is something that ultimately hinges on a paradox. All military activity, all war fighting is inherently bad for the environment. So given that, most countries, I wouldn't hesitate to say that pretty much every country wants to stay away from any of those kinds of limitations. The only place where you do see some action is in sort of victor's justice. The best example being after the first Gulf War, in which Iraq was required to, or actually some of the money that Iraq was required to give to the UN was funneled into funds that paid for cleaning up of oil spills, of the environmental damage caused by Iraq's scorched earth campaign at the end of toward the end of that conflict. The other category of activity is sort of everything else, but it's the positioning of military troops and of assistant personnel, of basing, of the movement of goods and troops and material around the world, testing weapons, and everything, developing weapons, everything that goes into getting up to the point of war fighting. So this is obviously an enormous category, also one that every military undertakes, even if they never actually go to war. And yet, this is also one where the efforts to control it have been surprisingly limited at the international level. Again, for the same reason. If you are a country with a military, you don't want to agree to unnecessary limitations on that activity. It's also a question where very few countries actually really have to deal with it in an international context, because most countries don't have bases outside of their own territory. The United States does, Britain, France, a few others. The Soviet Union did, and Russia now did, and withdrew from those in the 1990s. But it really becomes a question of a question for the larger powers in the world, and so inherently you're going to have already a stacked deck against anyone who's trying to create equitable international law around basing issues. There's also the issue of the dominance of bilateral law in this regard. Every country that agrees to host military forces has signed some sort of status of forces agreement with the country whose military is coming onto their territory, unless of course they've been conquered. But let's say the majority of countries are in this category. So the Philippines, up until 1991, was home to Subic Bay Naval Base and to Clark Air Force Base or Clark Airfield, enormous facilities. When the U.S. pulled out, it was discovered that we had, over the course of several decades, laid enormous environmental waste to the countryside. There was never a working sewer system at the bases, and so the result was just decades and decades of human and animal waste accumulating in the ground and in the water around there. However, for what it's worth, the Philippines, the government, after World War II, had signed a status of forces agreement that said it would take care of any of the side effects of U.S. action. The U.S. also said, look, when we're pulling out in the 1990s and we're cognizant of these problems, these environmental problems, we can't really hold ourselves responsible for actions that were begun at a time when no one in the world really considered the environmental consequences of this kind of activity. So we're not going to put ourselves in a position where we're suddenly responsible for actions that were taken under a different sort of paradigm or a different mindset. Ultimately, it comes down to a question of cost. If you were to require the United States or any country really to clean up after its military activity overseas, there really would be no end to what can be required of them. The U.S. recently paid $100 million, actually about 10 years ago, paid about $100 million to Canada to clean up two relatively minor facilities that we had up in the northern part of that country, and that's an instance where the impacts and the amount of damage was relatively minor. And we don't want to get into a situation where I mean the U.S. military, not obviously myself, where the military is having to check itself and spend an inordinate amount of time keeping its activities limited or somehow above board environmentally, and therefore possibly not doing as much as it can to fulfill its mission. That's its perspective, and that's the perspective of people in the government that I spoke with for the article. Now, all that being said, so you have these two categories around which there really is no corpus of international law and no motivation or no momentum toward the development of a corpus of international law. There is yet another category where there has been some movement, and that is on the sort of political motivations for cleanup. And there's one great example, and one that I think that I discuss at length in the article, and is something that could provide a framework for thinking about U.S. actions vis-a-vis Vietnam, and that is Japanese cleanup of chemical weapons left behind by the Imperial Army in northwest or northeast China. So when the military forces of Japan were withdrawing very hastily at the end of the war, they left behind some 700,000 unexploded munitions, bombs, shells, what have you, of all sorts. They had a whole range of chemical agents. And over time, most of them were buried. Some of them were just left in bogs and riversides, not really near cities necessarily, but over time, as the population grew and people moved into these areas, farmers started turning up unexploded shells. Construction crews would hit a shell and it would go off or it would leak. Over time, or over the last, say, 60 years, some hundreds of thousands of people have been affected, and many of them have sustained life-impacting injuries or have died because of this. So China has long pressed for Japan to do something about it. Now, until relatively recently, Japan has had no obligation to do anything. In the 1990s, it signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, which required signatories not only to get rid of their own chemical weapons, but also, if they had ever left chemical weapons on foreign soil, to remediate that impact. So again, there were very few countries that actually fell under that category, but one of them was Japan. Now, that being said, Japan, for a while, did try to resist doing anything under this. They said, well, we don't really have an obligation. They sort of, said, well, it's politically very difficult for us to do anything. You see the far right in Japan has a lot of power, and they don't want to take responsibility for anything that we did in China. But one thing changed over the course of the late 80s, moving into the 90s, and up till today, and that is that the relationship between the two countries has changed. Suddenly, Japan is not as powerful as it used to be, and China is much more powerful economically, geopolitically. The two are now each other's perhaps most important neighbor. And so Japan now sees a political need and an economic need to make nice with China. Now, there are certain things that Japan will probably take a long time to do in this regard. They'll probably never apologize for invading China, for example. But there are certain things that the Japanese decided in the 1990s, well, we can do. We left all these chemical weapons behind. We can address that. We obviously owe China something for that. And here's an easy way, a politically palatable way for us to address this question and therefore to improve our relationship with China. So Japan did really not a 180, but let's call it like a 130, and began to move toward an agreement, a joint effort with China. Since 1997, Japan has piled millions and millions of dollars into this effort. Things haven't gone as swimmingly as it was predicted. It's a very difficult thing to do. There's never been an effort on this scale before. The Chinese government is somewhat difficult to deal with when you're moving large, inexplicably technical machinery into their country. And there's also been corruption on the Japanese side. Nevertheless, the political will behind this effort has been quite striking. But the point is that the political will came about not because there was a moral obligation or because the legal groundwork changed, but simply because the political environment changed. And there's also an interesting parallel, not nearly of the same size, regarding the U.S. Having said all this about the U.S. never wanting to take account of its environmental transgressions overseas, there's an interesting comparison to the way that we've addressed this question with regards to Canada, as I mentioned, and Panama. Now, in Panama, we had bases in the Canal Zone for almost 100 years, and we, during World War II, used some of those bases, testing areas, mostly islands off the coast, to test chemical weapons. The idea being that the Japanese might use chemical weapons against us in the South Pacific, or we might have to use them against the Japanese. And there was really no understanding of what that would be like in a tropical environment. So the U.S. said, well, we have control over these islands, we'll test some weapons there. Now, they tested them, not all of them went off. There are, to this day, an unaccounted for number of chemical weapons sitting on a few islands off the coast of Panama. Now, the U.S. has offered, in addition to the kind of bare minimum cleanup that it did after it pulled out of the Canal Zone in 1999, we've offered a minor sum of money, I think a couple of $1 million, to help them clean up these facilities. But our position has been, look, what are you really asking for? You want to go in and clean up an unpopulated tropical island. You're going to destroy all of the flora and fauna to get to these weapons. You'll clean them up, and then the result will be the same as will actually be worse as opposed to just leaving them alone. So our response has been sort of just deal with it, and here's some hush money. Compare that with our efforts, our cleanup efforts in Canada. As I mentioned, a couple of relatively minor, small facilities in Canada that we pulled out of after the end of the Cold War. Canada said, yes, we know we promised to clean this up, but you guys owe us, $100 million to take care of this. I mean, we're not going to do this on our own. And besides, we're your biggest trading partner. We're your next door neighbor. Come on. And so, surprisingly, Realpolitik came to the fore. And in 1998, after a few years of saying, no, we don't do that kind of thing, the U.S. completely turned itself around and said, and this is according to John Hamre, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, there's no other country with the same combination of geography, historical relationship, and vital significance to U.S. national security, he said, and indicating that, yes, we're actually going to take care of this. However, he said this was a special case not duplicated anywhere else in the world. So what's important to note is two things. First of all, that because we have this relationship with Canada, we decided to go against what is a pretty clearly stated policy and to go above and beyond the status of forces agreement that we had with Canada and take care of the problem. At the same time, what was very important was the ability for the U.S. to say, this is a very special case. We're not going to do this for anyone else. And so that becomes kind of a very vague but I think useful framework for thinking about how could the U.S. come around to doing something in Vietnam, or what would be the requirements for the U.S. to do something? Because, first of all, there's never going to be a case where the United States recognizes a moral obligation. It's proven time and time again that is not a criterion. The U.S. has no legal obligation, either bilaterally or under international law, to do anything. But and the U.S. is going to charge a very high price, or there's going to be a very high threshold for the U.S. to do something because of changing political or economic relations. However, if there is a way to frame the assistance that is delimited, makes it a special case where the U.S. can say very clearly, we're doing this for you and we're not going to do it for anybody else, then you can start to see possibly, I think if that were possible, you would start to see some action. And in fact, that is what's happening in the case of the very limited cleanup that Michael discussed around Da Nang. The U.S. has said, well, we'll give you this money, but here's the deal. We're not doing it we're doing it for humanitarian reasons, which really means we're doing it just because, well, we want to make you happy and everything. But the conditions are, we don't recognize that dioxin is a problem. We don't recognize that there's dioxin in the area. We don't even recognize that you have any need for this money. But just in case you do, it's a few $1 million, and there you go. So that's that same kind of framing. Because the United States is able, or at least has the gumption to say, this isn't a recognized problem, but we'll do it for you anyway, we're then able to go ahead and do it. So as we start to think about or talk about some of these larger issues addressing the actual health consequences, it would be very useful for policymakers to think about how can we frame this kind of assistance in a way that is limited, that tends toward an explanation of uniqueness and allows the United States an out, which would prevent it from having to respond to similar claims from other countries down the line. That's an inordinately high bar. I don't think that there is... you'd have to be very creative, let's say, to come up with a really compelling argument in that regard. But I do think that given the history of U.S. actions in this regard and the legal framework that's out there internationally, that's going to be the only way forward. Thank you.
I should have introduced. That's Clay Risen of Democracy Journal. And now I'd like to introduce Phil Longman of the New America Foundation.
Thank you. Well, if you don't mind, I think I'll stay seated. I'm a little under the weather, I find. So I'm going to talk about the American veterans' experience with Agent Orange. And before I do, I just want to say right off that despite my appearance, I'm actually a little too young to have been in the Vietnam War. I missed it by a year. So I say that so nobody will confuse me with a draft dodger or with a Vietnam veteran who's got attitude. If I go into a rage here, I'm doing it on behalf of veterans, not because I am one. The other somewhat complicating factor for me today is that I am, as Paul mentioned, the author of this book, Best Care Anywhere, Why VA Healthcare is Better Than Yours. And I have ownership of that book. It's coming out in a second edition. I still stand by what it says, which essentially is that the VA, despite its mixed reputation, has undergone a quality revolution that has a lot to teach us about reforming the rest of the healthcare system. Thank you. But the VA does have problems. And when it comes to Agent Orange, many of those problems are very revealed. And it's interesting for even those who are not particularly interested in the subject. They reveal other contradictions that we carry around with us and how we think about healthcare, not just military health. It's, by way of a little background, the United States didn't even have a VA or anything like it until after World War I. There was no presumption that if you had any kind of disability or combat-related problem that we would treat you. Civil War Union veterans got pensions if they could prove a war-related disability, but we didn't have VA hospitals. The VA grew after World War II into what is now the largest integrated healthcare service provider in the country. It's had a checkered history, particularly during the Vietnam era, but has, as I say, undergone this great quality revolution in the 90s to the point that if you talk to most vets today, the thing they're mad about with the VA is they can't get in because we have this kind of crazy legacy that I don't think we've really thought about much because we just inherited it, that to this day we're not going to treat you as a veteran unless you're indigent or you have some service-related disability that you can prove you got in the service. There have been times when there were other exceptions, but that's essentially how the VA works. Now, when we got out of the Vietnam, guys started coming back, and they complained about things like chloracne. Basically, we said to those folks is, well, okay, we'll treat your acne, but any other kind of complications you have, we don't recognize that as having anything to do with your being in Vietnam. And it got real ugly for those of you old enough to remember. There was a moment when Carter's VA Secretary, Max Cleland, was testifying in front of the Senate, surrounded by a bunch of Vietnam War veterans. Cleland, of course, the triple paraplegic, and they threw their medals at him and said, well, you lost your balls in Vietnam, too. And there was Reagan's VA secretary who got on the Good Morning America show and used the occasion to call Vietnam veterans a bunch of crybabies. There was gigantic lawsuits against Dow and Monsanto, the makers of Agent Orange. They got settled in a way that left a lot of veterans feeling gypped. There were conservative think tanks that put out all kinds of reports about how it was just junk science that Agent Orange had anything to do with anybody's disabilities. And that went on for years until finally in 1991, it looked like we had gotten to a point where we were going to do the right thing. So passed a law that year that said if you served in Vietnam and you had one of three conditions that were by then now associated with Agent Orange, that would be a presumptive service disability and the VA would treat you. Then over the years, when that same act called on the Institute of Medicine to every year review what science was out there. And as the years went by, the IOM reports would come back, and they'd keep finding more and more complications. The big one came in 1999 when they found a strong association with type 2 diabetes, which of course is one of the most common diseases in American life. And much more recently, we've had new science on Parkinson's, early onset Parkinson's disease. Now, normally, when it comes to public policy, you want it based on science. I mean, right, we went through a last administration, everybody said they'd ignored science. Now we're all pro-science. But in this realm, waiting for science is a real bad thing. It's a real unjust thing. Because two reasons. One is it simply takes time and enormous amounts of data to make a generalization about any association. So we've been waiting for an army to die before this definitive science comes in. The other thing is, although when you think of a VA hospital, you might think of wounded warriors coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, there is only a small portion of the people being treated in VA hospitals. Usually, a typical VA hospital have 5% people, recent combat vets. Everybody else, middle-aged, aged. And their problems are the problems of aging. They're chronic diseases, mostly. Some of them brought on and exacerbated by Agent Orange and exposure to all kinds of other hazards in Vietnam. But in any particular individual's case, it's impossible to look at them and say, well, okay, your Parkinson's is caused by exposure to Agent Orange. Chronic diseases are always caused by a combination of genetics, environmental factors, behavioral things. So we're actually asking people to prove a metaphysical point that can't be proved. And we now have this gigantic appeals court system that's hearing 40,000 cases of people coming up saying, I got this problem, and I think it has something to do with my service, and you say it doesn't, and my lawyer says it does, and they fight it out every single day. Typical case would be, guy's 54 years old, finds his hearing's going. Thinks, well, that's probably because of all the artillery shells I was around in Vietnam. So he makes a claim for a hearing aid, right? And they come back at him and say, no, I think it was falling around all those rock bands in the 60s. That's what did it. And then there's a gigantic fight about who's responsible for this guy's hearing loss. Fortunately, there's a better way. What we need to do as a society is stop trying to condition people's access to health care on the basis of their being, qualified or deserving, right? There are access to health care because it's a right of citizenship, and certainly a right of military serviceship. Now, as I said, most of our vets today are elderly or late middle age because of the pattern of our wars. Most of them are going to qualify for Medicare anyway. The VA has excess capacity. Soon going to have a whole lot more excess capacity as the last of the World War II generation and Korea War guys pass along. It also has been winning encomiums for a decade now as literally offering the best care anywhere on metrics ranging from patient satisfaction to the use of information technology, evidence-based medicine. Anybody remotely acquainted with the quality of literature on healthcare of the last decade would know that the VA has the best care anywhere. Also, although it's kind of hard to get a hard number, it appears that their cost per patient as compared to Medicare is about 2/3. All right, so this is a triple winner. Open up the VA to vets who can use their Medicare entitlement. Not only that, open it up to their wives. Let them buy into the system. This not only makes clinical sense. An 80-year-old veteran's got comorbidities with his wife. They're both going to have to learn how to take care of each other. But it makes financial sense because every person you get off Medicare into the VA, you've saved maybe about 1/3. And patient satisfaction is incredibly high. So that's my case for what we ought to do, not just about the Agent Orange situation, but getting our veterans right in general. So thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your remarks. I want to open it up to questions from the audience in a minute, but first I just want to ask a few myself. And the first is that it seems like both in Vietnam and in the United States, and this is sort of the theme that kind of emerged as we were doing our research and editing the package. What you run into is the limits of science when trying to craft public policy, either foreign policy or domestic health policy. As Phil said, one wants to condition benefits or base promises of benefits on some hard numbers and hard science. In the case of both Vietnam and the veterans here, you run into problems with that. This is more of an open-ended question to the staff, but also to Michael. Is this something that Congress, the leadership in Congress, or the administration is going to have to deal with? And is it something that in your interactions with the Vietnamese they recognize? And I'd love to also hear you talk about the point you made, glancingly, that they see a difference in how we treat our veterans, the promises we make, and the science we argue shapes our benefits to veterans, and the way science is used in denying responsibility in Vietnam.
Let me start with, since it's the most recent one, the last issue, which is the difference in perception between U.S. veterans and how they're treated versus how the U.S. government, from the Vietnamese perspective, deals with the Vietnamese nationals who are exposed to dioxin. And Phil makes some good points about the nature of care that's being provided to U.S. veterans. And there's one category, for example, the blue water vets, for example. Under the way that it's been interpreted by the VA to date, veterans who served aboard ship off the coast of Vietnam are not eligible for Agent Orange benefits because they never put foot on soil in Vietnam. And that's how the VA has historically interpreted the law that was passed by Congress. Now, there are bills before Congress right now to address that issue that would extend benefits to the blue water vets as well as the Air Force, which is sort of interesting because in many cases the pilots were the ones who were spraying Agent Orange, but they may not be beneficiaries of the Agent Orange program because they didn't touch soil in Vietnam if they flew off coast. I don't know the numbers on that category, but it's an interesting concept. Having said that, as I was indicating, the way it's generally worked is that if you served during a certain time frame in the theater in Vietnam and touched soil, and you had certain medical conditions, as he said, was identified by the Institute of Medicine as having sufficient scientific evidence that the disease may be attributable to exposure to dioxin, and I hate it when I have to talk like that, but that's really how it kind of frames out, then benefits may be extended to you under the program. And that's where the science issue over time becomes a problem. Inside Vietnam, turning to that aspect of it, what my sense of it is in many cases you're dealing with health practitioners. They have a patient. They have somebody with a problem. They want to treat the problem. They want to treat the issue. And to a certain extent, they're not overly concerned exactly why that person has that medical condition. And so to the medical practitioners that I've met with, the people who provide care in Vietnam that I met with, really were interested in providing humanitarian assistance. Where things can get problematic is when U.S. money is involved, U.S. government money is involved. That money is earmarked through a particular program to be utilized in a particular way for certain types of beneficiaries. And so you can run into a problem where they have to try to attribute the medical condition to a particular cause so that the U.S. funds can flow to those particular patients. Now, there are ways that have been presented that can address that. For example, you can deal with the presumption of the population around Da Nang Airport. We'll provide medical services to people who live near the airport regardless of the nature of the cause of the illness. It's just a humanitarian assistance we're providing to the area because they're identified as an affected population. So there are ways that it's being addressed on both sides, but it at times can be, from the conversations I had with people, it can be very frustrating because you have the regulatory restrictions on the one side and the desire to provide assistance on the other.
Let me ask another question, and that is especially to Clay. As we look to the future, America's obviously involved in two sizable military endeavors and a lot of little ones around the globe. We are now pulling out of some of the smaller bases in Iraq, consolidating in the large ones. Eventually, those too will be handed over. Are we going to see some of the same problems in Iraq and eventually Afghanistan as we saw in Vietnam, in Canada, and so forth?
The beginning in the early 90s, the military actually did begin to recognize the political dangers of inherent in the pollution and environmental damage that was becoming evident on bases, not only domestically but also abroad as we started to pull down our forces in Asia and in Europe. And so there were congressional hearings, but more importantly, there were steps taken within the military to say, okay, well, going forward, we're going to try to be a little more careful about these things, if only because that's what is expected of very publicly visible public institutions, particularly something like the military. And when it comes to our activities overseas, we don't want this to become a reason why, the next country forces us to pull out. So that doesn't do a whole lot for bases that have been around for a long time. That damage is, so a lot of the existing or remaining bases in Germany, although those bases have always been a little better maintained than some of our Asian bases. But say something like Diego Garcia, there are enormous amounts of damage there that go back a long time, and despite our new recognition of the need to be better stewards in the 90s, that's just going to be there. So when you apply that question to Iraq or Afghanistan, I think that, you're going to see, as we withdraw, a better maintained facilities in that regard. That said, the reality is always going to be the same. The forces that we deploy in Iraq and Afghanistan are not there to be environmental stewards, first and foremost. I mean, that's very bluntly what the military says. They say, we're there to fight a war, and it is someone else's responsibility to take care of that. We'll do the best we can, but we're not going to sacrifice or cut corners. So, and they also still have the same kind of status of forces agreement that with Iraq and with Afghanistan that you saw before. So, yes, I think you can expect to see better facilities being turned over, or better, say, less polluted areas, but there's still going to be problems. And I wouldn't be surprised if down the road Iraq raises those questions and says, we've seen a higher level of morbidity in a certain area. We think that's because of X, Y, and Z that was stored there during U.S. occupation. So I do think this will continue to be an issue despite more attention being paid since the 90s.
Okay. I'd like to open up for questions, but first I want to recognize Walter Isaacson here in the audience. Walter, of the Chairman and CEO of the Aspen Institute, also leader on the effort to marshal support behind recognizing the issue of Vietnam and Agent Orange, and a contributor to our special report. So thank you, Walter, for being here. So some questions, gentleman in the back right here, Dan, and please wait till you get to the microphone. State your name and also your affiliation, if any.
Yes, my name is Peter Carpenter. I'm a Vietnam veteran who was heavily exposed to Agent Orange, and as a consequence was subsequently diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. I was the first such veteran to be granted benefits by the VA. As a consequence of knowing both Harvey Feinberg at the Institute of Medicine and Ken Kaiser at the VA, I was able to get them to go back and review the data. And I just wanted to thank the panelists and the organization here for the work that you're doing, because for the last 5 or 6 years, this has become sort of a forgotten issue, something that we thought we dealt with. And those of us who served are now getting it to the age where we are increasingly vulnerable to the long-term effects of the Agent Orange exposure which we had. And it's only going to be because of the work of people like you that we don't forget about the people who served then. So thank you very much for what you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service.
This gentleman right here.
Yeah, my name is David Adelstone. I'd like to congratulate Mr. Longman and his presentation and his solution. I think it's infinitely reasonable. I'm an attorney and have been involved in these issues for about 25 years. I was the legal director of the Vietnam Veterans of America and then the co-director of the National Veterans Legal Services Program. And I think your article needs some background and expansion. The 91 Act came as a result of litigation we brought against the VA, challenging the VA's interpretation of the 1984 Agent Orange Act. They were applying a cause and effect standard, which was absolutely not intended by Congress. It was overturned by the Federal District Court of the Northern District of California, and the case has been ongoing for the last 21 years. Basically, your gentleman that you mentioned in your article, once Parkinson's is concluded, he's entitled to retroactive payments from the first day he applied, not the day the regulation is. This has never been advertised publicly, as is Agent Orange outreach is never done publicly. The VA is under legal obligation to do both. They've done neither. And I would just, again, congratulate you on your analysis. I would correct one thing. Congressman Sonny Montgomery did everything he could to stop passage of the Agent Orange Act.
Really?
He fell in line along because of the litigation and because of the lobbying efforts of Vietnam Veterans of America mostly at that time. But he fought it tooth and nail. That was the only correction I would add to your article.
Thank you for that.
And I'd be happy to talk to you about it more anytime.
Mistake, but yeah, thank you.
There's a gentleman right here.
Yes, Hong Fong Fo, I'm here on my own behalf. I have a question for Mr. Martin. $2,000 to test for dioxin, is that the real barrier? Or what if we were to have a $2 test and it turns out that people who thought they had didn't and other people? What's the political implication for that?
As I indicated in my statement, the $2,000 figure was one that was cited to me by the Vietnamese authorities. I do know that there is efforts afoot, and Charles Bailey and the Ford Foundation, I believe, are part of that, to make available to the Vietnamese government test facilities that would lower the cost significantly. So there we can see another cooperative effort that's going on to try to address the issue. Now, speculating about what would happen if in a particular case you would find out that the tissue level is below what would be sufficient to indicate evidence that a particular illness, malady, birth defect, or whatnot is attributable to Agent Orange is a kind of speculative type question that's difficult to answer. And in some ways, the question may not be whether or not on a case-by-case basis you can demonstrate that the illness is attributable to exposure to Agent Orange. In some ways, as we're discussing in the case of the U.S. veterans, and to a certain extent from the Vietnamese perspective about the people in Vietnam who've been exposed, the issue may be more about trying to address the health problems of the population at this time.
In the back, right here.
Rick Whiteman, Vietnam Veterans of America. David Adelson didn't make clear his role, and which was seminal, not only in the court cases, but also in helping lead to the 91 Act, and Tom Daschle and Lane Evans pushing it through. David is correct that Sonny Montgomery did try and stop it, but it was Ted Weiss who stood in front of the train and wouldn't let the compensation COLA act go through. And Sonny tried to intimidate Ted, and Ted, as a teenager, had survived the Holocaust, so there wasn't much that the gentleman from Mississippi could do to Ted Weiss to scare him. And for that reason, VVA made him the Legislator of the Year in '91. But I do want to correct something. The perception is, and it creeps into the talk, that American veterans, in fact, the problems have been addressed of American veterans and their families. And particularly of the families and birth defects, the biggest concern right now of Vietnam veterans is not our kids, it's the grandkids. There's not a week that goes by that we don't have a young woman call the office and talk about her anomalies in her child, that wanting to know, is it due to exposures in Vietnam? The Institute of Medicine process that we have in place with the biannual review is a passive process. So they can only review original science done by somebody else. And currently there is not a single scientific study of Agent Orange or veterans funded by NIH, by CDC, by ARC, by VA, or by DOD. So if you don't have science to review, you're not going to make progress. 95% of the articles reviewed in 2006 and 2008 by the Institute of Medicine were done overseas, either by Norwegian countries or other countries in Europe or the Far East. So the real question is not just justice for the Vietnamese, although we certainly would like to see that, but it's also justice for American families that are still suffering. And so the real key is not just raising awareness that Agent Orange is still a problem having to do with Vietnam, but that Agent Orange is still a significant problem having to do with American veterans and their children and their grandchildren. Okay. Thank you, and thank you all for your efforts.
The gentleman in the far back there.
I am Stefan Stanton from Veterans and Military Families for Progress. I want to thank you for all your good work on this issue. And you mentioned earlier Max Cleland as VA director in the late 70s, and mentioned things started to change in the 90s. And I think a lot of that was due to Jesse Brown, who was Clinton's, for most of Clinton's administration, the VA secretary. And also you talked about the history of the VA. I think it's only been 20 years since it's been a cabinet-level agency. And today, and I was very encouraged by the selection of retired General Eric Shinseki to be VA secretary. That couldn't have been a better pick. Also a Vietnam vet. And I think it's really significant, for example, when President Obama announced his new policy in Afghanistan, he was included in the speech at West Point. And I guess my question is just for feedback on how encouraged you are in general at the, for the future and this administration, keep paying attention to the issue.
Thank you. More questions? This lady right here, please. Microphone's coming.
My name's Alice Day. I'm a filmmaker. In 2008, we finished a film on the documentary film on the environmental consequences of war. We certainly looked at the Vietnam situation, but right now, I'd like to think about the implications of this for what's going on now and in the future. You touched on this briefly. But we were interested in depleted uranium. we wanted to have something on that in the film. And we were told by people we talked with that there was absolutely no empirical evidence available to put a case for looking at this into the film. But in terms of the science, we gathered that the tests for this were not really being conducted in a way that would give science a chance to say something about this. And I think just from a point of view of the future and preventing some of these things, that this needs to be considered.
So I think Clay probably could best address that.
Sure. Yes, depleted uranium is an issue that comes up a lot. Is also an incredibly popular munition or element in munitions, mostly tanks and tank shells and artillery. So there's a decided interest against pursuing that very tough question. The issue is that there's a lot of incidental information, a lot of rises in increases in morbidity and disease rates in areas where it was used, a lot of suspicion, but not a lot of, as you said, science. And there are some studies that show no connection, but most people, even those who are skeptical of a connection, will say, well, when they're being honest, the jury is still out. And so we could see in the future, I could see someday down the line, there becoming a body of evidence that shows a connection, in which case this will become an incredibly important issue, because not only did we, the United States, use depleted uranium in the first Gulf War, but we and other NATO countries used it extensively in the Balkans, and we use it now in our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's simply, let's say, a question that a question for the future, and I hope that 20 years from now we're not having a very similar panel, but focusing on DU. It could be the case.
I think we may not have answered one of the gentleman's questions, and I think it was whether it's probably best for Phil, the Obama administration's appointments to the VA suggest a change in policy or on these issues.
Well, I think it's a mixed picture. One good thing they did early on is open up the eligibility a little bit more to people who had previously been promised benefits and had them taken away under the Bush administration. Some, for those who know, the priority sevens. But there's still an awful lot of people who served honorably in the military who cannot get in or will have to go through an incredible process. I think the Veterans Health Administration, kind of took a licking but kept on ticking under the Bush years. Towards the end, they were doing everything they could to sort of reinvent the VA of 1979 by pulling power back into Washington and taking it away from people in the field. I think there's signs that the Obama administration gets that, but they also need desperately to get their vaunted information technology to work on claims processing, because that's something that's just totally broken and stays broken. So there was a big fire in St. Louis in 1973, just destroyed a lot of service records. So there's a lot of folks there's a whole cottage industry that goes around just trying to help people establish that they were actually in Vietnam or even in the military, right? And the handoff from the military to the VA has been a problem too. They're getting better at integrating their records, but they're still not there. I think the threshold for what people categorize as mental illness changes from generation to generation. I don't think the VA is entirely at fault, but one of the things that it's confronted with is just record numbers of recent vets coming back and wanting and needing mental health services, and there's just again, they're hiring every psychiatrist they can find, but they're still and in traumatic head injury too. It's partly it's like there's not the science there, know what to do about it that much, but so there's deficits. But in the last budget, it raises the VA by 8%, which is pretty good.
Good sign. I want to get a quick fire, just sort of ask maybe 3 questions all at once, and we'll try to get the panel to respond in kind. There was a young lady right here we could start with. And please keep your questions brief, and we'll try to get as many as we can.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Mary Dolan. I am a very proud member of the Dialogue Group, and I'm also with the National Organization on Disability. To be brief, one thing that has not come up today has been, and let me just back up for a second. I had the opportunity to work on a paper funded by the Ford Foundation on Agent Orange issues and its impact on U.S. Vietnam veterans, and received quite a bit of assistance from David Adelstone and Rick Weidman, who just stepped out. I was floored by what I researched with the ranch hand studies and the CDC studies and the squashing, if you will. It's a harsh word to say, but the squashing of the science, the challenges that were placed on the methodologies. I'm curious about comments from the team up there on that. How there have been statements about how that science was done wrong, and not just wrong like whoops, but purposefully wrong. And how do you think that might provide another avenue, another vehicle for coming to terms with this situation here for our veterans and their families, but also as it relates back to the folks in Vietnam?
Okay, another question. Do we have time? Yeah, right here.
Yeah, I'm Alan Oates with the VVA. I'm the chairman of the Agent Orange Committee for the VVA. I've got a couple comments, and first for Dr. Martin, in the presumptive issues, when you say may be caused by, the Institute of Medicine uses different levels of association, and they don't establish the if it may be caused or not. They just show the different levels of association, and the Secretary makes a determination if the issue will become presumptive or not. So I just want to point that out. And most of the issues are limited or suggestive associations, or adequate associations, or limited or suggested of no association, but they're not may be cause. And I want to point that out. The other issue I have to speak on, and maybe the panel could reflect that they have knowledge of this, is the Agent Orange Act of 91. The proof in the pudding is always the implementation of the Act. In the Act, there were some requirements on the VA to conduct clinical studies, collect clinical data, and use that clinical data to determine if there's issues with Vietnam veterans. As of today, if you go to the VA and ask them for how many Vietnam veterans who served in Vietnam have Parkinson's disease, they cannot break that out, because they only collect data on Vietnam-era veterans, whether the person was in the service during the Vietnam period and they were in Germany, or they were somewhere else, or in the States and never went to Vietnam. So they can't break out that clinical data, so they never complied with that part of the law. The other part
we're going to have to wrap it up. Is there a question?
Yes, the question I have is, has the panel looked at any of the information on the implementation of the Agent Orange Act?
Okay, and very quickly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said 2 or 3. Let me comment on sort of the category of scientific research.
You might well move the microphone over to you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Addressing the issue of scientific research, comments 2. One is, if you noted in my presentation, I did highlight the need for continuing scientific research as something that the Vietnamese government see as necessary. And to a certain extent, you're seeing some interest in that in the United States government. And what I think is interesting is, in some ways, the Vietnamese population themselves present an opportunity for doing some of that research that would establish causality, or reason to believe of causality, of links between Agent Orange and certain medical conditions. So I think there's a potential wedding between the two of dealing with the population here in the United States and the population in Vietnam. There's also a third group, and I would feel remiss that we didn't discuss about that, which is Vietnamese nationals who've relocated inside the United States. Often a group that's missed in this issue. A number of them lived in Vietnam during the time and may have been exposed to Agent Orange and dioxin. They are not U.S. veterans of the war and therefore may not be eligible under that condition. And certainly the Vietnamese government wouldn't necessarily recognize their medical conditions because they're no longer Vietnamese nationals if they've naturalized in the United States. So there's a subpopulation in the United States that may be running into health problems that as of now we don't have a program that addresses their needs.
Again, on the subject of science, Alan Oates here knows most of what I know I know from him, but I think on this subject. But one of the things that just astounds me is that the VA does have this wonderful electronic medical record system that is held up around the world, and yet apparently it lacks a field in the program where you could just enter served in Vietnam between 1963 and 1972, right? Now, it would take effort to go back and do that, but this is an organization that converted from a pure paper record system, to this integrated digital system. Surely we can put that little record in. You might not be able to do it for every single Viet vet, but do it and big it up to a size that you can make reasonable generalizations from. The VA does this in all kinds of other realms. I mean, take that drug that killed more Americans that died in Vietnam, Vioxx, right? The VA was very early in glomming onto that because they could see these clusters of heart attacks, ask what all these people had in common, and realize that it was Vioxx. Well, it just seems to me you can do a lot of population health science, not worry about randomized testing and ethical issues and all the other stuff. You do it fast, and you could do it cheap, and I don't know why we don't do it.
Thank you. And I think we've probably dealt with. No, Mary, we didn't deal with your question, and that is the issue of Operation Ranch Hand. Michael, I don't know if you were on top of it enough. I know, Mary, we read your paper and the putting together of this, and whether you have any insight into her question.
I'm not a healthcare professional. Let me stipulate that to begin with. My understanding of doing studies of that sort is basically predicated on the econometrics and sort of the methodology used there, and a lot of the statistical techniques are very similar. For those of you who have looked over my report, there were indications that methodology may not have been followed in a very rigorous fashion on earlier studies. Having said that, I can't establish that. And to a certain extent, my view is rather than focusing on studies that were done a number of years ago, the issue, as I was trying to indicate earlier, is more on looking ahead to studies that could be done, that should be done, to try to make determinations with medical conditions. And with that in mind, as I said, I can see three readily identifiable populations in which these studies can be done. The population of Vietnam, the Vietnamese American population have relocated in the United States, and the U.S. Vietnam War vets.
Well, just in terms of wrapping up, I think one of the lessons that we took away from putting this together is what we have in Vietnam now is a situation where a lot of the geostrategic interests are aligned in a sense with our moral interests, that there's a very good argument that for U.S. national security interests, we ought to do right and deal with this legacy that we still have. That like Canada, like Panama, we have Vietnam is a country of increasing importance. This is an issue that they care about. We have a moral obligation, even if it's not something we would act on as simply as a moral obligation. And so I think the great question is Vietnam important enough that it could likely spur us to take the very difficult steps, I think, politically that would take to begin to deal with this issue of humanitarian aid to Vietnam. And so I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank my partner and in all things at the Washington Monthly, Dan Strauss-Tucker, for helping me put this together. The staff of the Washington Monthly, Carl and Claire Isley and Ashley Kenny, and also Dan and all the folks here at New America Foundation, and all you folks for coming. So thank you very much.